Turn with me, if you will, to the book of Luke. Luke, the fifth chapter. Oh, I'm sorry, fourth chapter. Luke, the fourth chapter. You know, the book of John, the very last verse of the book of John, says basically this, that if everything was written about Jesus, all the books in the entire world would not be able to contain it. Is that what it says? Now there was a lot of books in the Roman Empire. As a matter of fact, the Caesar's library had more books than what we have in the Library of Congress. And that didn't even include the Library of Ephesus, the Library of Antioch, the Library of Constantinople, or what was Byzantium, nor the Library of Corinth, the Library of Marseille. Doesn't even include any of those. And so when John makes this statement, that's a pretty good mouthful. But yet, if we go through the Gospels and you count the number of individual events, individual messages, individual parables, and everything about Jesus' life, you come up with 129 different events. Now, 129 events is far from filling all the books in the world. And so these 129 events, God preserved them for a reason, for a purpose. Now, those 129 events include Jesus' birth, his life, his death, his resurrection and ascension, his teachings, his miracles, healings, everything that we know about Jesus that is recorded in the Gospels ends up being 129 events. What happened to the rest of it? All those other thousands of things that could have been written, well, they were destroyed, they were lost, they became victims of war, many different things. But we do have 129, which means that these 129 events that we do have must be of utmost importance. Because of all those other things that could have been preserved and that God could have protected, they were not. But these were. That means that there's no such thing as a minor event and a major event. You know, many ministers, including myself, we have our pet sermons, the ones that we feel more comfortable in preaching more than any others. And all of you can probably relate to that because, you know, I'm assuming that most of you are believers or have been believers for many years. But is it possible to count the number of sermons that you have heard on the raising of Lazarus? No. Your fingers and toes together couldn't count all the times you've heard about Lazarus. Or what about the breaking of the bread and the fish and feeding the multitudes? Oh, dozens, maybe hundreds of sermons on those. Or Jesus walking on the water. Okay, another example. But what about this one? How many sermons have you heard on Jesus' response when he heard that the Galileans had the blood of the sacrifice mixed with their blood during the sacrifice? I don't think I ever remember a sermon on that. And if it was more like a teaching. And the one that we're talking about today is one of those that you may or may not have ever heard about. And the amazing thing about these 129 events, something that I discovered in my research, 111 of those 129 events were written also by non-biblical writers, which confirms what the Word of God says. And you know, archaeology and history does not prove that the Bible is correct. What archaeology and history does, it confirms that the Bible has always been correct. Okay? And so these 111 of the 129 were confirmed by Roman historians, by Greek historians, by senatorial scribes that followed the senators around and listed their life and that type of thing. And so this particular event we're going to talk about today is one of those that we know about, but it's one of those that you are reading and you read through it real quick in order to get to something really important. This is the healing of Peter's mother-in-law. Chapter number 4, verse number 38. And of these 129 events, if it's repeated more than once, it's of great importance. If it's repeated 2 or 3 times, it's one that you really, really have to pay attention to. 3 times this miracle is recorded. So it must be of utmost importance to us today. Why did God preserve these 129 events? Well, in my opinion, is that he knew that we would need these to live by in the 20th and the 21st century. So those were the ones that he preserved for us, for our benefit, so we could use these in the latter days, in the last days. So they're preserved for us, for you and me, for that purpose. Let's read. Verse number 38 says this, and I'm reading from King James. And he arose out of the synagogue, meaning Jesus, the synagogue in Capernaum, and entered into Simon's house. Now, this is Simon Peter. Simon's wife's mother, the early church said her name was Lucretia. And Simon's wife's mother was taken with a great, meaning deadly fever. And they besought him for her. And he stood over her and rebuked the fever. The Mark setting said that he took her by the hand and lifted her. And it left her, or the fever left her. And immediately she arose and ministered unto them. Now when the sun was setting, all they that had any sickness with divers diseases brought them unto him, unto Jesus. And he laid his hands on every one of them, and he healed them. Now, at this time in history, and the history of the Roman Empire, Rome was trading around the world. They were trading for lead and zinc and silver from Britain. They were getting horses from what we now call Germania. They were trading for cows and beef cattle from Spain. They were getting gold from different parts of Africa and from India. They were getting silk from what became Tibet, Nepal, northern India, spices from all of that region. They were getting cotton from what we now call Pakistan, and salt. They were getting salt from Austria. As a matter of fact, Julius Caesar conquered the region of Hallstatt, Austria, just to get their salt. Not to increase their territories, just to get the salt. And so Rome was trading all over the world. And some of the most expensive product that they traded for was spikenard ointment, incense, and silk. And spikenard ointment, this is not the sermon, but just a brief description. There's 2 types of spikenard. One of them you get it from the southern side of the mountains of the Himalayas, and that's what they use to make Indian incense with. But the most expensive spikenard is the Indus River in what is now Pakistan, what was India then, floods about every 10 years. And there's a grass that grows on the northern and eastern banks of the Indus River. And as the water recedes after being flooded, then a bacteria in the water attacks the roots of the grass. And the grass fights off this bacteria, and the gum that is secreted that connects itself to the roots are about the size of a little BB or a small buckshot or birdshot. And the people then pull the grass and collect these little BBs of rosin. and then they mix it with olive oil and a few other spices, and they come up with a salve or with an ointment that's called spikenard. If you want to see what it smells like, go buy some Fabergé Brut. But spikenard at that time, and still is today, the most expensive spice in the world. You can buy some at the Chicago Spice Exchange, and if you want to do that, it'll cost you $32,000 an ounce. And so it's something you don't run down to Walmart and get. Okay. But they were trading for spikenard and silk, and it was very costly things that they were trading for. Now they would get these in northern India and in what is now Nepal. Now in February of the year 24 A.D., there was a caravan that left that region, and the caravan was over 700 camels and mules and donkeys altogether. And so it was a large caravan, but it wasn't the largest. They had some caravans that had 2,000 and 3,000 animals with it, not including the guards and the workers and all that. So this was a large caravan that left and very expensive. And so, but reports began to come from the caravan that something was wrong, that the people were getting sick. They didn't know why they were getting sick, but they were getting sick. And some of the people even got sick to the point that they couldn't continue to travel. And so they tried to treat them with the typical method of treating, but it didn't work. And so the petition went out to Tiberius Caesar, who was Caesar at the time, that something needed to be done with this. And so Tiberius appointed his minister of health and welfare, and his name was Marcus Quintius Omericus, and he was the head of the Ministry of Health for the Roman Empire. So he was commissioned by Tiberius Caesar to find out what was going on. And so by January of the next year, January of 25, the caravan had reached the eastern banks of the Euphrates River. And so Americus left Rome and met them there. And when he met them there, he wanted to evaluate this disease. And what he discovered was the disease originally was accompanied with throwing up, with dysentery, and with kind of body aches all over your body. And then you would develop some tumors under your arms and tumors on your neck and between your legs. And these tumors would become larger and larger. And then they discovered that the very last symptom before death was a person would come down with a high fever. And the fever would go from 0 to 60 in point so many seconds. I mean, it really hit hard and fast. And once the person received the fever, they discovered that once the fever hits, that it is 100% fatal and 100% contagious. And so Americus tried to put together a system of treatment. And so he discovered this, that if these tumors were lanced before they reached a larger size, and then the liquid inside was caught in a cloth and then discarded, the chances of recovery increased dramatically. There would be about a 70% recovery rate. But if the tumors were not lanced and they broke open of their own accord, then the fluid inside would go into the air. And if the person breathed that air into their lungs, then the disease would be brought back into the lungs and the fever would be forthcoming shortly. Now, this is the same characteristics, the same symptoms of what became known later as bubonic plague. Now, some historians feel that this is the first record of the actual bubonic plague that hit the earth. Maybe so, we don't know. But we do know it had the same symptoms as this. And so they stayed at the Euphrates River for over a year and a half. During that time, the disease dissipated some. It began to stabilize, the people did, and it really didn't develop any more problems with people's deaths. They quit dying, in other words, of the disease. So Americus gave his permission for the caravan to continue on its way to Rome. And so they took off. And things went very well for a while, but then the disease returned. As you got more people, more villages you passed through, more cities you passed through, then there was more difficulty with the disease. The disease actually was carried by fleas that were initially on rats, and then the rats, as they attacked the caravan itself, the fleas found bigger prey in that they had camels and donkeys now. And so the fleas went on the animals, and this plague spread even more. Finally, they got to the city of Damascus. And in the city of Damascus, Marcus Quintus Americus had to make a decision. Do we allow this thing to get to Rome? If we don't do anything about it to stop the spread, then by the time it hits Rome, it'll be too big to fight, and it will overwhelm the empire itself, and certainly, if not the empire completely, the capital city of Rome anyway. And it would be devastating. Devastating to the state, devastating to the people. So with permission of Tiberius, they stopped the caravan in Damascus and says, we will stay here until we find a cure or find how to stop this. And so there was a number of experiments that were taken. And then finally, Americus came up with a plan of action that seemed to work. First of all, he inspected every individual in the city. It didn't matter whether you were the highest economic status or the lowest slave, you were inspected from top to bottom. If it was discovered that you had the tumors, then you were set aside. And if it was determined that the tumors that you had broken open of their own accord, and you had the fever, then you were placed in your house, your own individual house. And not only were you placed in this house, but anyone that came in contact with you, anyone who spoke to you, anyone who breathed the same air that you breathe, were also placed in this home. And the ones that the tumor had not broken of its own accord, then they were lanced and treated in that way. Now, the people who were then placed in the homes that had the fever or had the disease, then we've got to realize that by now it is 100% contagious and 100% death. And so with those folks in the home, along with those that would come in contact with them, family members, friends, anyone else in which they would have contact, they were shut up in that house in a quarantine. But not only were they shut up, but Americus himself took a torch, he set the house on fire, and those that were inside were burned to death. During a 14-month period, there were more than 6,000 there in Damascus who were burned by Americus. Didn't include the ones who died of the disease, but these are the ones that were burned. And it was standard procedure, not only standard procedure, but it became law by the dictates of Emperor Tiberius himself, that if you have the fever, then you have the disease. And if you have the disease, you will be burned along with everyone that you come in contact with, that you talk with, or breathe the same air. That is the mandatory sentence. No exceptions whatsoever. Finally, after this treatment of Damascus, it seemed like the disease had had dissipated considerably. And so they were given permission to continue on their way. The caravan entered the metropolitan area of Capernaum on September the 7th of the year 28. Jesus was there in Capernaum. It was on a Sabbath day. And Jesus was in the synagogue. And he was there doing the typical things that would do on the Sabbath day. When Jesus left Lucretia's house or Lucretia's bedside that day, she did not have the fever. She was sick, yes. I realized that she was sick, but she had not had the fever. But while Jesus was in the synagogue, then he was approached. We don't know whether it's Peter or Andrew or whomever it may be. And they summoned him. They said, "Come, Lucretia now has the fever." Now, Jesus had to make a choice. By Roman dictate, he had to make a decision that if he went back to the house, he had to stay because he come in contact with her. There was no ifs, ands, or buts. If he went back, he had to go into that house and be locked up with no exception. He also knew that the protocol was that the house was to be burned. 100% guarantee. So what we have here is a 100% chance of death, okay, by a couple of different means. But when Jesus was in the synagogue and he was summoned, even though he knew without a doubt that we're looking at a 100% death scenario, he went anyway. He went to the home of this woman who was death itself, willingly went into the home and was locked in there with her, along with others who must be locked up also. And then Americus, and we can read this information in the Roman records, he began to write his opinion. And it was fascinating to read it as I was reading it. And he says this. He says, "As I was about to lock the door of the woman who had the fever and those that were with her, then I was stopped by a rabbi from here in Capernaum. They call him Jesus. And he said that he was going inside. And I told him he could not get out. And he acknowledged that fact. But he went in anyway. And so we locked the door. And as I was about to lay the flame or the torch to the home, the door opened and the woman came out with no disease. And so, according to my evaluation of the situation, she was some way and somehow cured from the disease in which she was 100% fatal and death was her only option. And then he says this. He said, and the word spread. And as the sun began to set, hundreds came to the door of the cottage. And everyone who came were healed by this man. I don't know who he is. I know nothing about him. But I do know that the gods smile upon his face. And that was the last of this Roman testimony, other than the fact that he says this. On this day, in this year, the plague was stayed, and it never advanced beyond. And so not only was Lucretia healed, but the city of Capernaum was healed. And not only that, as they would journey to Rome, there would have been hundreds, if not thousands, of people who would have caught the disease, many of them dying. They were healed. And if it did make it to Rome, that great city of almost 2 million at that time, many of them were now healed because they weren't subject to the disease. History tells us that the bubonic plague remained a non-issue in the Roman Empire until 336 AD. So, because of what Jesus did on this day, then the world was spared for an additional 300 years. And many of those people who were spared were not believers. It's just Jesus and his compassion for the human race. He's the same God as he was then. Now we're going to challenge you. Maybe you have something in your life that has been determined that it is 100% death. Maybe you have a disease. Maybe you have a bankruptcy that's staring you in the face. Maybe you have a son or daughter or other family member who don't want to have anything to do with Jesus. And you don't know what's going to happen to their soul. But if something doesn't happen quickly, then it's a 100% guarantee of their death for eternity. What about your marriage? Maybe that's right on the verge of death. Jesus knows your situation. He knows your physical body. He knows your emotional body. He knows your circumstances. He knows that relationship with the children. He knows about the bankruptcy. But even in the face of 100% death, Jesus was summoned anyway. And when he was summoned, he responded. And when he responded, the death went away.